The rain fell in a soft, steady drizzle, turning the pavement outside the small coffee shop near the bus station into a mirror of gray and gold. Inside, the scent of fresh coffee and warm pastries clung to the air, cutting through the chill of early morning. Rachel Carter, 24, stepped through the door, shaking off the damp from her worn nursing student uniform. Her blonde hair was tied in a low ponytail, a few strands clinging to her cheeks. The overnight shift at the hospital had left shadows under her bright blue eyes, but her steps were steady and purposeful. She needed coffee, something warm, before heading home to her little brother. As she joined the line, she glanced briefly at the man behind her. He was tall, broad-shouldered. His military jacket faded and creased, the patches barely legible. His posture carried the weight of years of hardship. When an elderly man ahead of them struggled to reach a pastry, the soldier stepped forward quietly, handed it to him, and offered a faint smile. The small gesture caught Rachel's attention. She turned to order her drink, a small dark roast, and noticed the soldier thumbing through his wallet. 3 crumpled dollar bills, a few coins, enough for a coffee but not much more. Without overthinking, Rachel said softly to the barista, "His coffee's on me." The barista hesitated, then nodded. The soldier looked up, startled. Their eyes met. Hers bright blue, his a stormy gray blue that carried too many memories. "You don't have to do that," he said quietly, voice rough but sincere. "I know," Rachel replied with a tired smile, "but I want to." "I'll pay you back," she shook her head. "Just pass it on." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The sound of the rain tapping against the window filled the silence. Then she took her cup, offered one last smile, and stepped out into the misty morning. The soldier, Eli, stood there holding the warm paper cup, still stunned. "What kind of person does that?" he murmured. The barista smiled faintly, the kind the world needs more of. Eli took a slow sip, the warmth seeping into his cold hands. For the first time in months, maybe years, he felt something other than numbness. Across the city, Rachel unlocked the door to her small apartment, careful not to wake her little brother. The hallway smelled faintly of old paint and burnt food from a neighbor's kitchen. Inside, the space was cramped but clean, 2 bedrooms barely big enough for the essentials. Lego pieces and a half-built robot were scattered on the living room floor beside a notebook, filled with sketches and code. "Luke's World," the cover read in a child's handwriting. "Ra?" came a sleepy voice. Luke, 8 years old, stood in the doorway, rubbing his eyes, tablet clutched to his chest. "You're home," he mumbled. "I'm always coming back, buddy," she whispered, pulling him into a hug. "Did you get my raspberry yogurt?" he asked. She hesitated, then smiled. "Tomorrow, I promise." When he padded back to bed, Rachel sank onto the couch, exhaustion pressing down on her. Her shifts barely covered rent and groceries, and nursing textbooks were another burden. She'd learned to stretch ramen across 3 days. Yet she kept going, for Luke and for the parents they'd lost. Their mother had died of undiagnosed cancer when Rachel was 16. Their father, Sergeant Carter, was killed in Afghanistan less than a year later. The medal sat in a drawer she never opened. That night, in a dim-budget motel on the other side of the city, Eli Monroe sat on a lumpy bed, the neon light from the sign outside flickering through the curtains. On the table lay a manila envelope from the VA, adoption papers, hospital records, a birth certificate with his name but no listed mother. St. Margaret's Women's Health Clinic was stamped in the corner. He'd spent 8 years in captivity after a covert mission went wrong, presumed dead, clawing his way back to a life that no longer felt like his own. When the caseworker handed him the file, she'd said, "We thought you'd want to know. There may be someone looking for you." But there was no name, no letter, just a void where family should have been. Haunted by the memories of war, Eli couldn't shake the image of the girl from the cafe, the kindness in her eyes, the way she looked at him without pity. It had been such a small thing, a $5 gesture, but it had reached further than she could ever know. A few nights later, the ER at St. Mary's Hospital was eerily quiet. Rachel sat at the front desk, hunched over paperwork, her scrub top wrinkled and her coffee cold. The front doors buzzed open, and a man in his 40s staggered in, reeking of alcohol. "Hey, pretty girl," he slurred. "You got a phone?"
"Maybe I can call my heart, 'cause it just stopped when I saw you." Rachel forced a polite smile.
"Sir, this is a hospital. Do you need medical attention?" "Only thing I need is your number." he muttered, leaning closer. She stepped back uneasy. "I'm going to call security if you don't leave." The man reached over the counter, his hand brushing her wrist. Then a voice, low and firm, cut through the tension. "Let her go." Rachel froze. Eli stood in the doorway, half in shadow, wearing the same worn army jacket. His presence was calm but commanding. The drunk turned toward him, sneering, until Eli met his eyes. No threats, no raised voice, just a steady, unflinching stare. The man faltered, then backed away, muttering as he stumbled out into the rain. For a long moment, the hospital lobby was silent, except for the soft hum of the fluorescent lights. Rachel exhaled, her heart still racing. "Eli," she whispered. He gave a small nod, his eyes softer now. "You okay?" She nodded, still stunned. The night outside was still wet and silver, but somehow it felt different. Like the storm that had been following them both was finally beginning to lift. Eli asked gently if Rachel was okay, and though she nodded, she was still shaken. When she asked what he was doing there, he explained he'd had a VA appointment, missed it, and wandered in after hearing yelling. She thanked him, and he shrugged it off. She had once bought him coffee, and he owed her. Later that night, they sat together outside the hospital under a flickering street lamp, sharing vending machine sodas in silence. Rachel thanked him for stepping in, but Eli said she had looked tired and scared. When she admitted her father had served in the military and never came home from his second deployment, Eli listened quietly. She told him his name was Michael Carter, and that he'd written letters home about how the hardest part wasn't the danger but missing family moments. Eli's hands clenched, and when Rachel asked if he'd served too, he said yes. 8 years, though he'd lost track of how many people and places along the way. He confessed he wasn't good at being around others anymore, always waiting for things to fall apart. Rachel told him it hadn't, at least not that night. When she smiled and said her dad would have liked him, Eli quickly looked away, hiding the tear that escaped. That evening, 2 people carrying invisible scars shared more than a bench. They shared understanding. For Eli, her kindness was the first warmth he'd felt in years. Sometime later, Rachel was cooking spaghetti in her cozy apartment, the air filled with garlic and herbs. Drawings from her brother Luke and nursing school diagrams decorated the walls. Eli arrived hesitantly but was greeted with warmth. Luke ran to him, excited, and Eli smiled, letting the boy lead him to his seat. As they ate, the room filled with laughter and easy conversation. Eli hadn't realized how much he'd missed the feeling of belonging. When Rachel mentioned a sparking light switch, Eli offered to fix it, saying he'd learned to repair things in the Marines. After dinner, he kept his word and repaired it. Later, Rachel found him quietly mending Luke's torn jacket with a sewing kit he carried. When she thanked him, calling him kind, Eli admitted he wasn't used to anyone saying that. Luke interrupted proudly, giving Eli a drawing of the 3 of them with the words, "Dinner friends forever." Eli accepted it as if it were something precious. When he left that night, he told Rachel it had been the first meal where no one asked what he did. They just let him be. She told him he didn't have to be anything there, just himself. Before leaving, Eli handed her a small wooden bead from his first tour, saying it had always brought him luck. Rachel promised to keep it safe. As he walked away, for the first time, he felt like someone worth keeping. Days later, Eli sat on his motel bed holding a letter that claimed Margot Welling, a wealthy woman from a powerful family, was his biological mother. Shocked, he visited Rachel and showed her the letter. She was stunned too. Margot Welling was famous. Eli explained he'd never been told he was adopted and couldn't understand why this woman wanted to meet him now, after all these years. Rachel encouraged him to consider it, not for her but for himself, to find closure. Eli confessed he was afraid of feeling nothing, afraid that would make him heartless. Rachel told him he was simply someone who survived. After a long silence, he said he needed time to think, and she promised she'd be there no matter what he decided. But Eli disappeared. Days passed with no word. Rachel searched for him at the coffee shop, the bus stop, and the bench where he used to sit, but he was gone. Then one morning she found a note under her door. In it, Eli wrote that she'd been right. He deserved to know the truth, but he didn't want her to see him if he broke. He promised to come back if he still knew how. Rachel pressed the note to her chest, her heart heavy but proud. Eli wasn't running away anymore. He was walking toward something painful, but this time on his own terms. A week later, Rachel was in the kitchen making grilled cheese and apple slices for Luke. who hummed as he scribbled in his notebook. The evening news played softly in the background, but her thoughts were elsewhere, with Eli wondering where he was and if he'd found the answers he was looking for. It had been almost a week with no word, but she held on to hope that he'd return just as he'd promised. Got it. Here's the full paraphrased version of your story rewritten into smooth, connected paragraphs in narrative form, no key points, no breaks, keeping the same emotional tone and details while phrasing everything anew. It's written as a continuous flowing script-style narrative in paragraph form. The silence weighed on Rachel's chest, lingering even as she tried to focus on the sound of the knife rhythmically meeting the cutting board. Then Luke's voice broke her thoughts. "Rachel, look," he said, pointing toward the television. She turned, her attention snapping to the screen just as the anchorwoman's tone sharpened into urgency. "In breaking news tonight," the voice declared, "Welling Energy, one of the nation's leading renewable energy conglomerates, has confirmed the return of a long-lost heir. Eli Monroe, a former Marine missing in action for 8 years, has been verified through legal and genetic documentation as the only biological son of CEO Margot Welling." The broadcast shifted to a slideshow of images. Eli, clean-shaven, dressed in a sleek charcoal suit, standing beside a frail older woman in a hospital bed, his hand covering hers. He appeared calm, but something in his eyes betrayed the storm beneath. Pain, remorse, and a kind of sorrow that no camera could disguise. Rachel's hand went numb and the knife slipped from her grip, clattering onto the board. Luke looked up from his cereal, puzzled. "That's Eli," she managed to whisper, her voice hollow. She couldn't speak further. Her throat had tightened painfully. The sting reached her eyes before she could fight it back, not from shock alone, but from the heavy realization pressing down. He had never told her, never even hinted. He had simply vanished. She sank into the nearest chair, her trembling hands pressed against her lap. "He said nothing," she murmured faintly, as if speaking to the quiet air. "Not one word." Luke frowned, sensing her unease. "Are you okay?" he asked softly. Rachel nodded mechanically, forcing a thin smile. "Yeah, baby. Just surprised." But inside she was breaking. A crack opened in her chest, spreading fast and deep. She wondered if she had ever been anything more than a temporary shelter. A resting place for a man who didn't belong to her world. Was she only a brief refuge before he returned to the comfort of wealth, legacy, and spotless headlines? That night, after Luke was tucked into bed, Rachel slipped into her jacket and walked out into the quiet streets. The pavement still glistened from a recent drizzle, the air cool and still. Without planning where she was going, her feet carried her through dim-lit streets until she reached the hospital, the place where Eli used to sit for hours in silence, lost in his thoughts, watching strangers come and go. There was the bench, familiar and empty, but something rested upon it, a folded piece of paper with her name written across it. Her hands shook as she picked it up and unfolded it. The note began simply, "Rachel, I've watched you carry the world on your shoulders with more grace than I've ever known. You gave me coffee when I couldn't buy it myself. You gave me shelter when I didn't ask. You gave me laughter at dinner and silence when I needed to breathe. You gave me a home, but I needed to face my past before I could see any kind of future. I didn't know how to tell you that, so I ran. I'm sorry. I just needed time to believe I was worthy of what you offered." There was no signature, none needed. She knew his handwriting, his rhythm, the small imperfections in his letters. Rachel sank down on the bench, pressing the note to her heart. A swirl of emotions tangled inside her, hurt, betrayal, foolishness, but beneath all that, an ache that wasn't anger. She had seen the real Eli long before the headlines had. She had loved the man who wore thrift store jackets, who fixed her broken outlet, who made Luke laugh with ridiculous faces. That man hadn't been an illusion. He was part of the truth too. Perhaps she hadn't lost him. Perhaps he was only trying to find the man he truly was. As the wind whispered through the night, Rachel lifted her gaze toward the stars and murmured, "You should have told me." Folding the letter carefully, she stood and walked away. Behind her, the bench remained empty, but inside her chest a fragile hope lingered, quiet but unbroken. Some weeks later, inside the gleaming headquarters of Welling Energy, anticipation filled a conference room made entirely of glass and light. Media crews darted about, adjusting cameras, testing microphones, their voices merging into a chaotic hum. Every major network was there. The story of the returned heir had captivated the nation. At the front of the room stretched a long white table surrounded by attorneys, executives, and board members, all waiting. Only one chair at the center was vacant. Then, as murmurs rippled through the crowd, the doors opened. Eli Monroe walked in. His suit was simple navy, his shoulders squared, his gait measured and deliberate. Every step seemed to hold equal parts resolve and vulnerability. As he approached the podium, whispers surged around the room. He did not sit. Instead, he stood at the microphone, taking a breath before speaking. "Good morning," he began, his voice steady but resonant. "I know most of you are expecting me to speak about inheritance, about succession, about what this means for the Welling Energy empire." He paused, scanning the rows of faces before him. Then, as his gaze drifted to the back of the room, it caught on someone. Rachel. She stood quietly near the exit, wearing a pale blue blouse and jeans, her blonde hair falling softly around her shoulders. Eli's lips curved faintly before he continued. "But I'm not here to talk about fortune," he said. "I'm here because not long ago I was just another man in a worn-out uniform. I didn't know who I was. I had no name that carried weight, no family that remembered me. I was angry, lost." The room fell utterly still, and then someone bought me a cup of coffee. His tone gentled, almost reverent. She didn't know my name, didn't ask for one. She just paid for my drink and told me to pass it on. It wasn't about the coffee. It was the first time someone saw me, not as a soldier, not as a ghost, but as a person. Confusion flickered across the crowd, but Eli's eyes didn't leave Rachel. "Her name," he said softly, "is Rachel Carter." Cameras swung instantly, lights flaring as every reporter turned to locate her. Rachel froze where she stood, heat rising to her cheeks, every instinct urging her to disappear. But she couldn't move. Eli stepped away from the podium, accepting a handheld mic as he approached her through the sea of whispering executives. Stopping a few feet away, he lowered his voice. "I came here today because I've realized something. This company, this name, this money, it means nothing if I don't know who I am without it." He took a step closer, his eyes never leaving hers. "You reminded me that I was still human. You made me laugh again. You thanked me for fixing a broken outlet like it mattered. You showed me that maybe I still mattered." The room glimmered with flashing bulbs, but neither of them seemed to notice. "I found my blood," Eli said, his words carrying through the silence. "But you found me." A wave of hushed awe swept across the room. Rachel's eyes filled as she whispered, barely audible, "You disappeared." Eli nodded. "I did," he said, voice thick with honesty. "Because I was afraid. I thought that if you saw the truth, who I really was, you'd turn away. But the truth is, you saw me before I even knew myself." The cameras were still recording, but for once the world's noise didn't intrude. Turning briefly toward the reporters, Eli added, "She gave me coffee. I want to give the world something better because of her." And then, with quiet defiance, he took Rachel's hand and led her out of the room. No cheers followed them, only a profound, breathless silence, as though everyone had witnessed something purer than news, something human. A year later, sunlight streamed through the glass doors of the Carter Community Wellness Center. A small brass bell chimed gently as families entered, their faces bright with cautious hope. The building was modest but full of warmth. Cream-colored walls, flower boxes blooming beneath the windows, and a wooden sign above the door that read, "In honor of James Carter," hand-carved and lovingly painted. Inside, Rachel stood behind the reception desk in a soft green blouse and white sneakers, handing out flyers to new visitors. The center, funded by the Monroe Welling Foundation, offered free medical care to low-income families, walk-in clinics for veterans, and counseling for those healing from trauma. Every hallway carried sunlight, every room carried stories. The nurses, once dreamers, now worked with purpose made possible by compassion and by Eli. Eli himself had become something of a legend, though he never sought the title. The heir who walked away from the empire, the Marine who traded mansions for missions. Within a year, he had given away nearly 80% of his inheritance, funneling it into shelters, schools, and homes for veterans. He declined every offer of power or prestige, telling one journalist simply, "I don't want control. I want change." And change followed. That autumn, just beyond the town's edge, a new community took shape, a neighborhood called Anchor Grove. Designed with open kitchens, wide porches, and gardens between each home, it was a haven where no veteran would sleep on the streets again. When the ribbon-cutting day arrived, Rachel and Luke were among the guests. As the crowd celebrated, Eli led Rachel toward one of the finished homes. A single porch swing swayed gently in the breeze. "I wanted you to see this one first," he said. She turned to him, eyes shining with pride and something deeper. "You did all this?" she asked softly. "No," he answered, smiling. "We did." The wind lifted her hair as Eli reached into his coat. Instead of a ring box, he pulled out a small paper coffee cup, the same kind she had used the day they met. Inside it was a tiny velvet pouch. Rachel's laughter broke through her tears. "You kept the cup?" she whispered. "I kept everything," Eli said, his voice low as he knelt before her, the porch's shade wrapping around them. "You gave me coffee, Rachel. But more than that, you gave me something I'd never had before, a place to belong. You gave me peace. You gave me home." Opening the pouch, he revealed a simple gold band. "I'd like to give you forever." Her answer was a trembling yes, tears glistening on her cheeks. "Always. Yes." Behind them, Luke whispered mischievously, holding up his phone. "You better kiss her, man. I need this ending for my video." Eli laughed, stood, and pulled Rachel into his arms, kissing her as the sun dipped low behind the newly built homes. Later that evening, Luke uploaded the clip, a short, unpolished video of a porch swing, a paper cup, a kiss, and soft text fading in across the screen, from caffeine to commitment. Within hours, it spread across the internet. People shared it not because it was glamorous, but because it was real. And somewhere within that quiet story, people found hope again. The reminder that even the smallest act of kindness can grow into something vast, something transformative. One cup of coffee, one moment of warmth, one life rebuilt from the simplest beginnings. The world didn't need another fairy tale. It needed this, a story of love, redemption, and the belief that even in silence and brokenness, connection can still take root. From that single spark of generosity came a legacy not of wealth or power, but of compassion and healing. And as the lights faded on their story, one truth remained, that kindness, no matter how small, can change everything.